Hey everyone, we're going to be talking about insight today, different ways of solving problems. So let me start with my prompt and then we'll get right into it. Okay, so I'm going to switch my screen so that we can go over some documents here. I put everything into Outlook, so just bear with me for a second. I'm going to switch to my Outlook screen. Okay, looks like I need to quit and reopen, so I'm going to do that real quick. Oops, I hope that wasn't too disruptive. All right, let me change over. Okay, did that switch to OneNote? Yes, it did. Okay, so insight. About insight, we are referring to a certain method of problem solving. Typically, when people solve problems, they use analytic methods. This is often what we are used to and what we are consciously aware of when we're trying to navigate a situation. Analytic methods involve things like thinking through a solution. If you think back to school, or perhaps if you're in school now and they give you a long paragraph and you have to reason your way through various different components of the question, and then you analyze your strategies and how you want to problem solve, those are analytic strategies. People are very used to analytic strategies, but they're not so used to using insight to solve problems. Now, we could argue that insight is more important than analytics because insight is like getting the whole picture for what's going on, whereas analytics is kind of like looking at the details. Sometimes you can miss the bigger picture for the details. So, when we talk about insight, this is especially useful for mental health. As you can imagine, if somebody comes to you with mental health issues and you just give them the analysis on how to solve the problem, like someone is trying to lose weight, and you say, well, just cut your calories by 500, track that every day, and don't eat junk food. It's not going to work, right? Anyone who's done therapy or anyone who's worked with other people or anyone who has tried themselves, they know that doesn't work. Typically, they also already know those logical steps. But what we find is that certain insights are needed so that the individual is able to develop a deeper understanding for why they are doing what they do. This has been the backbone of a shift in psychotherapy that we call context based approaches or process based approaches, looking at the bigger picture as opposed to sticking to the details. Are you going to solve a person's problems or help them manage their mental health issues by telling them how to think? Or is it more useful to give them certain insights so they have a more generalized picture on what it is that is going on? So, in terms of insight, a basic definition here: sudden change in the formation of a concept or other type of knowledge representation, often leading to the solution of a problem. So again, instead of looking at the content of the problem, we're kind of looking at the context or the bigger picture of what is going on. When you see this, you find that you could go through 100 different problems, but if you don't have that bigger picture, it's kind of fruitless. A great example of this is trying to understand addition through solving multiple addition problems. You could go through 1,000 problems, but if you don't get the underlying concept for what addition is, it's going to be very difficult. Once you get that underlying concept, like what the arithmetic operator means, and you get an intuitive understanding, then you can solve any addition problem without having to memorize each individual one. In common language, insights are often called aha moments, and you'll see this in the literature as well. There are some discrepancies between how closely related aha moments are to actual insight itself in terms of neural bases. We're not going to get into those details here. When you suddenly get it, right? You can't really explain it, but you suddenly get it. That's what we're talking about for insight. And insight is generally, if not always, a nonverbal problem-solving mechanism. This is why when we're looking at mental health diagnoses or issues, and we use strategies such as meditation or psychedelic-assisted psychotherapies or imagery-based approaches, those typically involve insights in terms of understanding what it is that is going on. So again, basic takeaways here. Insight refers to a sudden understanding, more so like a holistic understanding of the underlying issue where somebody previously may have been stuck. And there's a more concise definition here. I saw this in an article. I thought it was a great definition. Any sudden comprehension, realization, or problem solution that involves a reorganization of the elements of a person's mental representation of a stimulus, situation, or event to yield a non-obvious or non-dominant interpretation. That is a very wordy way of saying what we just said above, but this is more of a comprehensive scientific definition, so to speak. So again, you reorganize the way you understand something, the overall picture, the holistic picture, and that leads to a different way of seeing the overall picture in a way that you didn't see before. That's what they're referring to here. Excuse me, because insight is primarily a nonverbal thing, me trying to explain things verbally is going to be quite difficult for understanding. So let's spend some time going through a few examples. I pulled these out, easy to understand examples that give you an insight-based understanding for what insight is. Okay, and before we show these pictures, Gestalt psychology, for those who are not familiar, Gestalt is kind of like the same thing. This was more of a, I don't want to say primitive, but maybe old school, outdated now, but still certainly relevant in many different ways, type of psychology where the idea is that the sum of the parts is not necessarily equivalent to the whole. So if you get the whole, the sum of the parts may not necessarily equate there because the whole picture might have a greater meaning than just the sum of the parts. Or you could convey it the other way around, just general inequality there. There's more to analyze in terms of the overall picture as opposed to just the details. Okay, so perhaps one of the easiest examples here is the Necker cube, which is just the cube in front of you. People typically draw this in art school or whatever. You put a square, 3 lines, add the square on, then put the 4th line in. This is a good example of what we're talking about when we refer to insight. So when you look at this cube, you can see it usually in one of 2 ways. One way might be, and this is a little hard to explain, but if we're looking at this back face here, let me find a highlighter to show you. Oh, I think I went too far. Let me see how to get the highlighter here. Okay, if we look at this square here, that square, you could interpret that as being the front or the back. In other words, coming closest to you or being further away from you as you look at this cube. And when you do this, you might find that your brain shifts the way this cube looks to you. At one point, that face might be in the back. At another point, it might be towards you. And that changes the overall gestalt or overall interpretation of what this cube looks like. Try to play with that for just a few seconds. Perhaps you can pause the video and see if you can change the way that square is oriented on the cube. Now, you can do this non-verbally, but if you try to explain to someone how to change that cube from front to back, good luck. It's really difficult. But again, this is more of that intuitive, non-verbal, insight-based approach. You can sort of do it non-verbally. The cube comes towards you, the cube goes away from you. And if you practice a little bit, you can control that in terms of how you want to look at the stimulus because your overall understanding of what you're doing has altered. Now, here's a great example. This is really famous in psychology. I suspect people have not seen this before, but if you have, still just as great of an example. Just take a second and look at this. This is also from Gestalt psychology. So here we have a bunch of, depending on how you see it and how you interpret it, typically people will say there's a white picture with a bunch of black splotches all over it. Now, you could say it the other way around. There's a black picture with a bunch of white splotches on it. Really depends on how you are interpreting the stimulus here. But either way, when you look at this and someone tells you there's a hidden image here, you'll start to scan through, see if you can figure out what this image is. And oftentimes people will eventually find, again, this isn't something you can really tell yourself to do. In fact, if you try and you try to group together the dots or take some systematic analytical approach, it'll probably get you stuck more than anything else, right? Like if I'm looking up here and I'm trying to make something out of these splotches or down over here on the left, it's difficult to do that. Or here's the left. I think that mouse translates there. Here on the left or up here, it's difficult to do that. And if anything, trying to adhere to those details very closely, that's going to cause limitations. Now, if the image is going to show its full effect to you, what tends to happen over time is that you'll look at this image for a while and you'll be really confused. And you might be thinking people are just out of their mind when they say there's a hidden image in here. But eventually, you will see that there is a hidden Dalmatian in this picture. If you have never seen this image before, that might be hard to believe, but there is a hidden Dalmatian in this picture. And once you get it, once that insight comes to you, you can't unsee it. That's another interesting thing about insights. Once you get that whole picture of what's going on here, you cannot unsee it. I can attest to that because the first time I saw this image was, I don't want to say 10 years ago, but 5-10 years. It's been a minute since I've seen this image. And ever since I saw it the first time, I have never unseen what has been here. So it's kind of a one-time effect. I'm about to ruin it for you. If you don't want to see the answer and you want to figure it out for yourself, this would be a good time to look away. But the Dalmatian is right here. This is the back leg. This is the other back leg. Here is the body, the torso, so to speak, of the Dalmatian. Here's the head pointing downwards. Here's the ear. And here's one of the legs. And here is the other leg. Perhaps you can see that now. Now, when I take away the highlighter marks, I bet you can't unsee it once it clicks for you. And this tells us a lot about how our psychological functions work, right? We'll talk about this in just a second here, but we know that there are hemispheric differences in terms of how we analyze information. Left hemisphere, right hemisphere. I'm referring to our brain, the two cerebral hemispheres. They both differ drastically in terms of how they interpret information. And there's more nuances there. It's not like there's one guy in a box here, one guy in a box here, and they're constantly fighting each other. Honestly, they share more functions than they differ, but we'll go over that in just a second. But anyways, the functions that we're talking about here, these are primarily right hemispheric dominant for most people. We know of variances based on handedness or just general variances. Certain conditions can cause those changes too, but for the most part, well over 90%, it's going to be right hemispheric activity. So now that you see this Dalmatian, you can come back in a year, let me know, send a comment, see if you can unsee this Dalmatian. Now, you will see that there are people who see other types of stimuli in this image as well. And this is also important to talk about because insights are not always correct. We need to mention this more in literature because insight, especially when we're looking at types of therapies that involve altered states of consciousness, because consciousness, as it's perceived, is primarily nonverbal. You typically experience different states of consciousness through its contents, and those contents are nonverbal images and so on. We tend to rely a little too heavily on insights being correct, and this is certainly not always the case. It's just like an analytic approach. An analytic approach can be totally wrong, but it can still get you in a certain direction. So we have to reality test not only insights, but also analytic approaches. So someone might look at this image and say, maybe there's a mouse. Let me see, make sure my mouse is pointing at the mouse in the right direction. Maybe there's a mouse upside down right here. You can see the body there. There's an ear. Here's the eye. Maybe you could argue that, let me see what else is here. There's a face here, black, some sort of pareidolia. Again, you could draw many different types of interpretations from this stimulus. It's not necessarily right or wrong. This is where the context part comes in. The insights that you get, they're not necessarily right or wrong. It's more so about how useful are they for you. That's probably the best way to understand what we're doing here. Yeah, I could say there's a Dalmatian here. My argument for a Dalmatian being there is that the original creator of this image said that this is supposed to be a hidden Dalmatian image. That doesn't necessarily mean that's the correct way to interpret this image, right? You could look at this a whole different kind of way. Again, the way you understand something comes down to the context and the overall meaning that something has for you. This is why people can look at one image of art and draw 1,000 different conclusions from it. The basis there is not necessarily about being correct when it comes to intuition, insight, and right hemispheric functions. It's more so about what is useful for yourself. Now, analytic approaches, we can make the same argument, right? When we talk about math and we talk about understanding things through symbols, breaking down reality into symbols so that we can manipulate reality and understand it in a way that's useful for us. It's not necessarily correct, but it does work in a way that we intend it to. And that's good enough, right? There's commonly arguments that the universe is mathematical. It's like, well, we're projecting a little bit of our own bias there, right? It's more so that mathematics is a model of how we think the universe works. And this model works in ways that we plan it out to work, right? That's totally different than saying reality itself is mathematics. It's just a model that tends to work well. Doesn't necessarily mean the universe is mathematics. It's just mathematics models well onto how the universe is. So when we go through insights, I can't emphasize this enough. You have to reality test your insights. This will become relevant as we talk about how and why insights are relevant to the psychology of awakening. All right, let's move on from here. So some other interesting comments about insights, and you're welcome to read through these. I'll try not to spend too much time. I'll scroll down for that last one. Insights are frequently accompanied by a burst of emotion, including a highly positive surprise at either the content or manner of the realization. This is primarily because insights primarily function through nonverbal processes. When we try to analyze a problem, we are engaging in a very conscious approach. When you take a conscious approach and you try to understand something and it doesn't work, you get stuck. You don't know what to do from there. Perhaps you're given a math problem and you can't find the solution to it. Your analytic approaches have failed. However, if you are thoroughly engaged with this problem and you are intent on solving it, motivational factors, psychological factors, attention mechanisms, if these are all intent on solving that problem, even though your analytic approaches have failed, that doesn't mean the problem cannot be solved by you. Actually, what we find is that the problem continues to be processed by non-conscious or unconscious psychological functions. Subconscious may be a better term to use there. It depends on what functions we're getting into, but a combination of subconscious and unconscious functions. Basically, what happens is you try to solve a problem, it fails, but your mind is still chewing at the problem. It's just doing it in a way that you're not consciously aware of. And as it's doing this, it's really, really interesting how this works. As it's doing this, if you suddenly get it, if your mind suddenly solves the problem, we know from imaging data, fMRI data, EEG data, that other psychological functions will temporarily be inhibited so that the brain or mind or whatever can express the intuitive, insight-based solution it has found. It's basically your brain saying, aha, I've got it. Now let's show it to the person. And then it inhibits other functions that you're doing so that it can show you what it is that's going on. That's just super, super fascinating to me. Your own brain is chewing at problems that you couldn't solve analytically. Again, a lot of different tenants inside the apartment, so to speak. And again, that burst of emotion, it's not always related to insight, but it's often there because insight comes from problems we couldn't solve through analytic approaches. If you're trying to solve a math problem and it's been 2 weeks and then you suddenly get it and it comes to you, yeah, you're going to be pretty happy, right? Andrew Wiles is a great example of this. I think there's a video out there, not sure if it's still out there, but he was working on, I think it was Fermat's last theorem. I'm not a mathematics person, but it's something like a to the n plus b to the n equals c to the n, and that is unsolvable for n is greater than 2. So something like that. I'm sure the math people can correct me there. And he was able to resolve this theorem, which had remained unresolved for over 300 years. And he describes the insight he had. He was stuck. All the analytic approaches he had gone through, they had failed. Actually, he had a solution to it, and then it was reviewed. Some holes were found. He had to bridge those holes. That's where he was stuck. And then suddenly he had his insight, and he got it. The overall answer came to him, and then he was able to definitively show that he had resolved the theorem. And there's a video out there of him describing his experience. He breaks down in tears. Again, it's a very emotional thing for him. There might be some other reasons for this as well, including affect functions of the right hemisphere. A lot of different faculties or possibilities there. Okay. And yeah, worth mentioning again, insights are often a surprise to us. This is, again, very strange, right? Maybe this is an area where global workspace theory has its own claim to fame here, because the insight that your brain comes up with, it's so important that it pushes it to conscious awareness, so to speak. And when it does that, other functions are inhibited, and it comes at a surprise to you, right? There's somebody working down in the basement, all of a sudden they figured it out and they send it up to the main floor, and you're surprised, even though it's all your own psychological functions. Again, it's a very strange area to talk about, especially in terms of the weird understanding you get that you are a culmination of different functions as opposed to one singular being, so to speak. Okay, insight solving occurs in a discrete transition from a state of no conscious information about the solution to the final complete solution with no intermediate states. The conscious experience of insight directly relates to unconscious processing that precedes it. This is basically what I summarized earlier, right? You try to solve a problem through analytic approaches, and what you know, it doesn't work. You get stuck. Your brain continues to work on this, and then you eventually get a solution, and that solution comes to you through unconscious processing. An easy way to understand this, it's not necessarily a perfect relationship here, but when you try something and you have a hard time with it, let's say you are trying to drive a manual car. And when you're trying to drive this manual car, everything feels so rigid at first. You have to like consciously think about shifting to first, when to shift to second. It's really rigid. The car is jerky. It doesn't go well. And then when you come back the next day, it's a little bit easier. Well, hopefully it's a little bit easier to shift the car again, because even though you struggled at first, your body continues to work on the issues at hand. And then when you go the next time, you get to reality test again the deeper understanding or deeper problems that were solved when you were away from the car itself. It's just like cramming for a test, right? You want to study and then give yourself some time to process the information. Exact same thing with insights here. Okay, so let's move on from that. I've already talked about it. Yeah, and just getting into a little bit of the neural basis. I keep saying I don't want to get into the jargon of it. Maybe I will get into some of this neural jargon and neural basis. I'll do it for a different video. I know some of my older videos, especially neuroanatomical and neuropsychological functions, people seem to have an interest for that. So I may try that in the future, see if there's a desire for it. But anyways, insight culminates with a sharp increase in neural activity in the right anterior temporal lobe at the moment of insight. I should have pulled that article up, but there's a really nice image where it's kind of like the hotspot image, a thermal graph, so to speak. And you can see when you look at EEG data and you run through the quantitative EEG analysis, you can see that there's a very strong red dot, lots of neural firing at this exact moment of insight. So again, you can think of this a little bit easier as a bunch of little people working inside of a building that is your brain. And the engineers down in the right anterior temporal lobe, they suddenly say, hey, we got it. And then they raise their solution up, and that's exactly what's going on. It comes to your conscious awareness. Very, very cool stuff. Essentially, what we're talking about here, the most important takeaway is that, especially for the psychology of awakening and resolving a lot of these causes and problems that lead to psychological suffering, you can do this more effectively through the basis of insight. Insight you can think of as a precursor to wisdom, someone who understands the overall picture. They understand the overall picture in a way that reflects the way reality operates. That's essentially what wisdom is. So we'll come back to that as well in just a little bit. Okay, yeah. And again, insights are immediately preceded by a transient reduction of visual inputs that apparently reduce distortions and boost the signal to noise ratio of the solution. Again, just a fancy way of saying that your brain brings it up to conscious awareness. Okay. Now, we'll spend some time here. I think this is really important. And for people who know things about hemispheric functions, left and right hemisphere, they perhaps know of Ian McGilchrist's work. He's a psychiatrist. I believe he's written several thousand pages now on differences between the two hemispheres and what the implications are. So this is a very complex area, a lot of details to discover, a lot of details to discuss. But we're going to take a very simple approach here. Again, this is very relevant to the psychology of awakening. Okay, right hemisphere contributes relatively more to insight solving than to analytic solving, whereas the left hemisphere contributes more to analytic solving than to insight solving. So, actually, I don't need to draw it. I brought a picture in. We're going to spend some time on this image here. Oh, it's cut off. Let me see if I that. Yeah, that looks better. Okay, so brain lateralization. This is basically saying that when we look at neuropsychological functions, or in other words, how the brain works in terms of brain behavior relationships. So, for example, when you think about the brain, you can think of this as a very tight real estate area. You can think of this as New York City, okay? New York City, you got tons of different people, different silos, different buildings, different areas, and they all do certain things, right? You might go to the transit system, you might go to the grocery store, you might go down to a club. They all do different things, but it's all tightly packed into a very dense area, New York City. Your brain is exactly the same way. When we look at the size of the brain, it's no accident, right? Our brain is inside of the cranial vault, or your skull. Okay. Your skull is enclosed. The brain is enclosed. It's a very tight space. There are a few foramen or openings in the skull, but again, it's still really tightly packed. And as far as things go, it's kind of like an egg, right? Your shell is the skull, and then the brain on the inside is just sitting there. If you shake the egg, it's going to shake the brain around. It's a really tight space, right? The brain just can't keep growing. It can't just keep expanding. And I don't remember the exact articles, but you will see some studies arguing that the size of an infant's head is basically maximized relative to the size of the birth canal, because if it was any bigger, the mother would probably die, or the infant would die, or both would die, because things would just be too complex. And I'll need to double check this, but I believe infants are born without a completely intact skull. And later on, I believe cranial sutures, I'm a little rusty on neuro at this point, cranial sutures seal the skull in place, and everyone has a unique cranial suture design. But this head is so big on an infant, because we have such large brains relative to our size, that it really couldn't be any bigger, right? I mean, the skull's already coming in pieces. We got to pass this infant through the birth canal. And if it was any bigger, then you'd have more complications. So even before birth, right, even as the fetus is forming, we're in tight spaces. So there's limited capacity here. Kind of went on a tangent there, but basic takeaway, we got tight space for the brain, and all the different parts of the brain you can show through neuropsychological literature, data, testing, lesion studies, and so on, that different areas of the brain have different functions. And Wilder Penfield, a neurosurgeon, was really good at showing some of those things as well, especially for this gyrus here, your precentral gyrus and postcentral gyrus for motor cortex here, and somatosensory functions here. So not only does the brain have really distinct functions in certain areas, we also see distinct functions across hemispheres. Now, again, the entire brain is interconnected. So what this means is that the brain is, I mean, we say there's two hemispheres, but is it really two hemispheres? That's just the way it looks to us, right? Everything's interconnected in that sense. So really, the left and right hemispheres, they share more functions than they are distinct. These differences here, they highlight some of the unique differences that you see. But again, these functions are shared to a certain extent. We just know that there are asymmetries in the hemispheres, and these asymmetries do correlate to different dominances in psychological functions. So when we get into left and right hemisphere, and this has really been left and right differences, this has really been taken in stride by mainstream media. I don't think it's as much the case anymore, but this stuff was really a big deal when we first started looking into hemispheric differences. And you started to see research coming out from certain areas about like split brain patients, Does that split the person into two distinct senses of self? Is it still one distinct sense of self? Just appears as two? Ongoing debates there, still technically not resolved. But media basically basically took this and split people into left brainers and right brainers. You'll still see comments every once in a while. If somebody's super scientific, super analytic, they'll say, oh, look at this left brainer here, or whatever it is for the opposite. People will label in that sense. Again, more functions are shared than they are distinct, so those labels are not necessarily accurate when we actually want to look at scientific scrutiny in detail, but they do give a general pointer at least. Okay, so let's go into different functions here, right? Left brain, analytical, detail-oriented, rational thought. You can read through the list here, math, science, and so on. And then the right hemisphere, we see things like intuitive, holistic, nonverbal. Left hemisphere is more verbal, vision, motor skills, all that good stuff, right? We know that language functions for most people, it is a very distinct area in the left hemisphere. It's going to make sure I'm putting my mouse in the right spot. It's about right here, and you have certain gyri and hotspot areas that correlate very closely to receptive and expressive language functions. We don't need to get into that for this video, but you don't really see those on the right hemisphere. The right hemisphere is more so about nonverbal processing. It also has more to do with attention functions. In fact, we see that when you apply more attention to a task, it proportionally recruits right hemispheric functions even more. I've mentioned this before, but it also gives us a good understanding for what we're doing when we get into meditative approaches and such. Okay, so main takeaway here is that there are different dominances in how the brain can problem solve things. We can correlate these pretty well, and perhaps causally in some cases too, to different hemispheric functions. Your right hemisphere is going to be really good at looking at the whole picture, nonverbal processing, problem solving in that sense. Your left hemisphere is going to be really good at analyzing details, breaking things down, reductionism, scientific approaches, what you might think of for a physicist, someone who is really good at math. Those tend to be really closely correlated to left hemispheric functions, whereas someone who is perhaps more of, you might say, like a monk or a wise person, or someone who really tends to look at the bigger picture of what's going on. They aren't really reductive in that sense. Those are more right hemispheric functions. Maybe an easier way to explain that, if you go and read the Tao Te Ching or Tao Te Ching, that book is like capital A right hemispheric functions. If you go and read some hardcore scientific literature, you're going to see, like, let's say a book on neuroanatomy that's super in-depth, super concise. That is like class A left hemispheric type functions. So you can differ in that sense as well. Again, it's a little bit stereotyped, but main takeaway here, your brain solves problems in different ways. Both hemispheres work together, they work in tandem. And as you can imagine, if you take a detailed approach based on what you know and it doesn't work, we got to send it over to the right side, and we need to perhaps reanalyze the way we're looking at the problem itself. And your right hemisphere will look at that. Now, if you look at the big picture with right hemispheric functions, you might miss certain details. If you look at the forest, you might miss the trees. If you look at the trees, you might miss the forest. So we see a very concise balance here between how the two hemispheres operate. And by the way, you can't see it here. The corpus callosum is a bundle of white matter or tracks that connect the two hemispheres. It's right under here. You can't see it, but these two hemispheres are connected. Okay, I think we've gone over that enough. So let's keep going here. Now, in terms of the relevance to Psychology of Awakening, there's so much to say. We're not going to get this in 20 minutes. If you want more details, my book covers things in a much more concise way. But in terms of just a general overview here, when we're talking about insights, this is what is perhaps most important when it comes to dealing with psychological problems. And the reason for this is because analytic approaches, they're really good for things like engineering, math, physics, things that you can take a reductive approach for that lead to a solution that works when reality tested as intended. Psychological functioning is not really reducible in that same way, right? The way a sunset looks to you can't really break that down. You can give it certain descriptors. It's beautiful, it's red, one of a kind, unreal, but you can't really give the full picture to someone else, right? This is where that hard problem of consciousness comes in. The qualia, or the subjective experience, or the nonverbal experience of something, you can't break that down into words. It is the same way with our psychological functions. This is where the basis of insight comes into play. If we can see, instead of trying to attack different thoughts or different emotions, if we can see how the overall understanding of something can be changed, that is the way to help psychological issues. You will see this in effective psychotherapy. People who are seasoned therapists, they know how to talk in a way that leads to insights for other people. It leads to a deeper understanding. They don't really look at the content. They might look at the content, but they know that it's more so the context and the bigger picture that matters when we talk about psychological functions. So when we talk about roots for psychological suffering, for example, this is something that is best learned through the basis of insight. Sure, you can take an analytic approach. You could sit down with a therapist, perhaps a cognitive behavioral therapist, and you can go through and you can get a piece of paper and draw out 7 different boxes and draw the arrows connecting the boxes and put things together there in that sense. Yeah, that's an analytic approach. But the way it's going to help someone is it's going to give them an insight into how they are operating. If you could just write a box, 7 boxes, and say, oh, your anxiety leads to a panic attack. The panic attack is caused by social anxiety. Social anxiety is caused by difficulties engaging with others. Difficulties engaging with others is caused by problems from a childhood experience where you had to speak in front of a class and it all went wrong. Yeah, you could do that, but until they get the bigger picture, it's not really going to be super helpful, right? So when we build these insights, we help people deal with psychological suffering. And in terms of the psychology of awakening, I present insights as a very important way to not only figure out what leads to psychological suffering, but also what can lead to the end of psychological suffering. And this is because if you understand the root causes for something, you also know what the ways to end those root causes are. Once you understand the basis, you understand how to take away the basis. It's the exact same thing with causes for psychological suffering. Now, in terms of insights and specifics here, let me see what I want to get into with the time we have left. Yeah, and this top one, I'm not going to read it over, but the way we solve problems is essentially a reflection of how we've trained our minds. For most people, it's very analytic because that's what culture, society, and basically everyone around you wants you to do when you're dealing with problems. Not necessarily the best way or the worst way, but it is the way that we're most used to. Okay. So I saw this as well. I thought this was a really good summary on what happens with insights. And then we'll spend the rest of the time talking about cultivating insight. This is where we get into the heart, or the more important parts of what the psychology of awakening involves. So, preparation. The person actively engages with the problem, they gather information, attempt to solve it using analytic conscious methods, often ends in an impasse, meaning they can't solve the problem and they get stuck. Problem is temporarily put aside, but unconscious processing continues. This period, which may involve rest or engaging in unrelated activities, allows time for basically the mind, brain to process and figure things out. Once it figures and processes things in a way that leads to a non-dominant or different way of interpreting information, you get an aha moment, right? And this is where you get the new solution. It's not necessarily correct, but if it's useful in a way that someone intends it to be, then they can reality test it. And if it works when reality tested, then we have a pretty good indicator that we're getting somewhere useful, if not already at the destination point. Okay, so we take these 4 steps here and we think about this now in terms of the psychology of awakening. How can we apply insights and thinking in this way to find not only the causes, but also the roots and the ways to end psychological suffering? My proposal, and let me take a step back here for just a second. My proposal is not the only way to do this. It's just, in my opinion, the safest way to do this, because there are other methods you could use. Some of these involve pharmacological substances, psychedelic substances, various forms to induce altered states of consciousness, like starving yourself or eating certain kinds of foods or sleep deprival. I don't really want people to engage in these kinds of dangerous practices. Now, certain things like psychedelic assisted psychotherapies, research is building on these things. There perhaps are safer ways to do them, but jury is still out, to be totally honest. Meditation, in my opinion, is one of the safest ways to do this. When we think about what we're doing with meditation, we are training our attention towards specified goals. You could argue that's what meditation is in its entirety. Now, when we train our attention, remember what we said earlier. When we recruit attention more, we are recruiting right hemispheric functions more. Right hemispheric functions involve what? Intuition, insight, nonverbal processing, visual functions, lots of different aspects there. So when we engage in meditative practices in proper ways, we are going to start to experience altered states of consciousness. Altered states of consciousness are experienced because the contents and the states of what you are experiencing change. We know this from many different types of studies, as well as from just direct experiential practice. The way your brain is operating changes. And the way your brain is changed, it correlates pretty closely to what types of experiences you can have at any given moment. And again, since we're going through nonverbal imagery, we are experiencing things through the form of altered states of consciousness, this gives us a basis to analyze and think about things from insight. Psychedelics might be an easier way to understand this. You see all sorts of vivid imagery, the lights are going, everything's sparkling, and people suddenly just have these insights, right? They just occur. It's like, oh, I get it. It all makes sense. It's all coming together now. You can do the same thing with meditation. Again, we can use these 4 steps here to help us guide insight and meditative practices. If you are trying to solve an issue, let's say you're trying to figure out what are the causes of psychological suffering, and you don't really have a clear answer. Maybe you get certain things from Google or whatever, or you think about it yourself, emotions, maybe the way I think, maybe language functions, maybe addictions. Those are a good start. But once you get those deeper understandings from insight, you sit there, you meditate, and you don't really use language functions in this sense. You're more so sitting and non-verbally processing information until insights come to you. Once you master and get good at this ability, you can start to cultivate insights that come to you. You might suddenly get a deeper understanding, right? Instead of looking at alcohol, anxiety, being around other people, feeling lonely, maybe you get a deeper insight, like all these experiences are without a permanent nature, something like that. And you start to put this into practice and you start to reality test it, tease it apart, apply it to different parts of yourself, reality, everything around you, even during the meditative experience. And you find something that you just can't break apart no matter what you do, whether it's from insight or analytic approaches. That's a good indication that you're finding roots that are correct in their own ways. So when you're engaging in practice, you don't want to just stick to insights that come to you. Basically, what we're doing with the meditative approaches is we're going to sit there and set the right parameters that allow you to cultivate insights based on the problems you're having. Shouldn't really be an intensive thing in terms of trying to force yourself to do something. It should more so be like just setting the right conditions. Kind of like growing a plant, right? You don't need to sit there and tease the seed apart and forcefully work with it. You just set the right parameters. When you do that, things naturally grow and progress on their own. It is the same way with your meditative practices. If you set your attention in the right way, if you set the right parameters, the experiences will naturally come up on their own. And we could probably spend more hours talking about, maybe we will, talking about different ways of specific meditative practices that can work. But more or less, mechanistically, you set the right parameters and you don't hook yourself to any type of experience that you have. Because if you hook yourself to that experience, then it becomes an analytical thing. Then you get stuck, your attention gets narrowed. But if you keep everything broadened, whole pictured, unattached in that sense, then you have set the right parameters to solve problems that you're having. If you can do this correctly and master it for yourself, that's pretty much all you need for the psychology of awakening. It's kind of like magic. It really is like a superpower. Imagine you just sit there and answers come to you. They actually do when you practice correctly. This isn't something that's based in mysticism or magical, superstitious stuff. I mean, I'm citing research literature here, right? It quite literally says in the articles, the answer will come to you, and it just comes to you on its own based on how the brain works, nonverbal processing, and so on. This is not speculative stuff, right? If you engage in this practice, if you set the right conditions, you will gain insights that help you and work for you in terms of dealing with psychological suffering. It's all there in the literature. It's just putting it together into an overall understanding. Science is really good at that, right? The analytic pieces, we have all the different details, but parsing it together into a cohesive picture that works, that's where the psychology of awakening comes in and all these different methods. If you are able to meditate and you're able to create these altered states of consciousness where you start to get the imagery and your right hemispheric functions are working, I'll scroll back up to show those here on the right side. When you start to see these things and you don't attach to them, your brain is going to solve problems through the basis of insight. It feels nonverbal and it feels like a sudden aha for yourself. But remember that most of the processing is unconscious. Unconscious, even though it's not in your conscious awareness, that doesn't mean it's coming out of nowhere like magic. It just means your body is working in the background, like engineers in a basement. And then once they fix up the pipes in a certain way and you turn the tap on the main floor, it works and you get it, right? It's a really cool thing. It's just building your attention to where you can do this for prolonged periods of time. It's quite challenging in Western society, especially because we're so used to having narrowed forms of attention and focus. Just think about going on social media like TikTok, or if you're on YouTube in some cases, and you're just scrolling through endless feeds. Your attention is there for about 3 seconds. maybe 50 seconds max, and then you move on to the next thing. And if you ask them after an hour, what were you looking at? They don't know, right? They're kind of lost. It's like, I don't even know what I was looking at. So it's detailed stuff, but the focus isn't there. It's very difficult at first, right? Imagine, you don't have to imagine, just try it for yourself if you haven't had much meditative practice. If you're sitting there and trying to focus without focusing too hard, just getting this right blend of attention, it's really difficult. Your mind is going to pull you towards everything that it can to get you to refocus on a task. And this isn't because your mind is evil or it's against you. It's because your mind is doing what you trained it to do. If you are trained to look at problems and look at them in detail and then analyze those single details, that's what your mind is going to do. If you have trained yourself to apply your attention and you can control those functions in ways that you want, then you can sit there and allow your attention to solve the problems for you. Insights will come to you. It really feels like a magical thing when you do it. I guess it is in certain ways, but it definitely works. My book, I go through all the different neuropsychological mechanisms at play, and I also give different methods that work. But overall, this is something you can do for yourself. You don't have to take my word for it. You don't have to take anyone's word for it. Just try it for yourself. When you can cultivate attention, not only does it help you with insights, it also helps you in many different areas of life. I've covered this in different videos, but we have different brain networks at play. Brain networks refer to different regions of neurons that tend to work together when we look at them through imaging. And we know that when you meditate, when you train your attention more specifically, there are certain areas of the brain that become thicker. And these areas are basically the ones that direct how your attention is going to problem solve a task. Again, left hemispheric functions, narrowed attention, right hemispheric functions, broader attention. But imagine you train yourself to be able to do both at the same time. That's the point I want to get across. This isn't about just switching over to right hemispheric insight based functions, because if you rely too heavily on insights and intuition, you're going to have problems as well, right? These people, perhaps you meet someone who's like this and they can tell you the whole picture, right? They can tell you the big picture of just about anything. But when you get down to the scrutinized details, it's lacking. An example might be if you go and talk to, I can pull from my own experience here. If you go and talk to a certain sage or listen to them like a wise person, so to speak, but they aren't really versed in scientific techniques, they might say the earth is made of like, what do they say? Like earth, fire, wind, water, the elements. It's like, okay, that's not necessarily wrong, but it's not correct totally in its sense either, right? Because when we look at the periodic table of elements, we see that things break down even more there. So it's not that intuition and insight is better than analytic approaches and left hemispheric functions. It's that the balance is most important. We have two hemispheres for a reason. If it was all about right hemispheric functions, then we would just see a giant right hemisphere for our brain, right? Evolution has had billions of years to figure this out. Almost all species have two hemispheres for this very reason. It is the balance of functions that matters more than specific adherence to one function or the other. So again, training meditation, training these abilities, training insight, very helpful, very useful, especially because they are undertrained for most of us, but it shouldn't be the sole reliance for what we do. We should become balanced in terms of how we take things. All right, we're just about at 1 hour. I don't see any questions, but I do see one person. If you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them. If not, no pressure at all. I'll go ahead and wrap this up here shortly. I'll wait here a little bit, and if not, I'll just close things out. And I'll scroll back up in case people didn't get to see this stuff earlier. Just a really basic example. I think this is such a cool example. It's just really easy to understand. When we're talking about insight and nonverbal functions here, the Necker cube. I can't believe somebody named this cube after themselves. But yeah, basically this cube here, you can look at it so that this face, let me highlight it again. Oh, that's a terrible highlight. There we go. Okay, that face in the back there, that one, you can view the image so that it's towards the front or towards the back. Can't really explain to you how I do that, but non-verbally, it makes total sense to me. I can sit there and play with the image in my mind and how I'm visually seeing it. The image goes to the back or it can come to the front. These are more non-verbal, intuitive, insight-based functions based on how you understand this. And it's not necessarily correct to see the cube in one way or the other. This is a good example of where context matters. What is most useful for you? Is it seeing the cube in the front, seeing it in the back, or the balance between having the capability to see the cube in either way? Okay, I don't see any questions, so I'll go ahead and just close things out here. Thank you for listening to those who came, and I will see you next week.